ART. And primarily, I've been asked to cover these following topics by Dr. Kedar: semen analysis, semen processing, IUI, embryo grading, cryopreservation, and pre-implantation genetic testing. So it's quite vast, quite a lot to be covered, but I'll try to cover as much as possible. And if you find that you want me to continue on another day, I can do so. And as suggested, we can take the questions after each topic, or after the first three, we can take one set of questions, and then for embryo grading, another set, and cryopreservation and PGT, the other questions. So to start with semen analysis, today we have the WHO Manual 2010. It's all the procedures related to that are in this WHO manual, and this manual is available free to download. This is the 5th edition. The first edition came in 1980, and as you will realize, the first IVF was in 1978. So the systematic semen analysis actually started much later, much after IVF. And this particular manual actually talks about the basic aspects, what are the optional tests that need to be done, the research aspect, and also talks about processing for IUI, IVF, and ICSI. It also talks of quality assurance and reference values. And when I say that, it will be surprising for many of you to know that till this 2010 manual, whatever information on the standard values that we had, or the reference range that we had for this, were based on, were very arbitrary. There was no systematic analysis on the basis of which the reference ranges were set. Now, to start with the sample collection, well, we need to know the days of abstinence. And for a long period of time, we thought that a minimum of 2 to 3 days of abstinence was essential for the diagnostic purposes, for analysis, and even for processing. However, recent studies show that shorter the abstinence, better is the quality of the sample, especially in terms of morphology and the motility of the sperms. Important is the continuous collection close to the laboratory. Now, a couple of reasons for this is, one is, yes, the temperature changes if you're staying in extremely hot environments, and then you may have a lot of motility of the sperms which would be affected. Also, the risk of contamination. And another thing that we find is, which is risky, is the possibility of mix-ups. Now, when I say mix-up, many of you may be aware that we have strict guidelines on ART, and according to these guidelines, whenever a donor sample has to be used, it has to be anonymous. Now, culturally, people do not prefer an anonymous donor, and we found that most of the people prefer somebody known. Now, this puts us in a dilemma, because what patients prefer and what the guidelines state, or the future law states, is going to vary. Now, in order to match that, people do things where, as a clinic or as embryologists, we could get in trouble. So a mix-up would be more like an intentional mix-up, and therefore I would say in any ART clinic, it is better to have the sample collected in the premises. Second thing is, we do need to know the time of collection, because longer we keep the sample before analysis or processing, we will have detrimental quality in terms of motility. Of course, the container needs to be sterile, non-toxic. We have to be extremely careful about the plastics that are used, because plastics are known to be toxic to sperms. And what may happen is that we may interpret the sample as saying poor motility, but in reality, it could just be an iatrogenic cause because of the toxicity of the container. And labeling. I mean, imagine that situation. I mean, we had this movie Good News, which made such a hue and cry about mixing up of embryos, and for a common public, it would see, how can you do that? But in reality, in the lab, I mean, all the embryos, whichever the couple it is, and all the sperms look fairly similar, and the risk of mix-up is extremely high, and therefore labeling is very, very important, and handling is very important. Also, we need to give proper instructions, written, oral, etc. For example, we've seen that one particular case, we had an analysis, normal count, motility, patient was scheduled for IUI, and on the day, all the sperms were immotile. Now, it's very frustrating when you get such a sample and you wonder what has possibly gone wrong and why are all the sperms immotile. And all the previous analysis reports were good. So how do you justify that? And then it turns out that the volume was very low and the patient had added some water, which led to immortality of the samples. So you never know what a patient may come up with. So we need to be very, very careful on these aspects. So, well, as a clinician, you would have taken the history of the patient, but also be sure that at the time of collection, the technician make sure that you get the history of the patient, especially of any history in the recent past. For example, if a couple, the husband has been asked to undergo semen analysis, they may not essentially do it immediately. They may decide to do it after, say, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And in that period, if he has landed up with, say, fever or any such thing, then what may happen is that the motility would be affected. And we would invariably unintentionally label it as an asthenospermic sample, asthenospermic sample, and then your whole manner in which you are thinking would be altered. Also, history of medications. We have a lot of young patients who are on a different kinds of medications for chronic ailments, and many of them could affect spermatogenesis. So it's important that we also take this history. And it's well known that smoking, extensive alcohol use, drug abuse affects sperm count. And generally, when you ask a patient, and they'll say, "Oh, it is just occasional or social." We don't really know what that occasional means, whether that occasional is every day or once a week or once a month. So, and generally, they may not give the complete picture to the clinician. So it is advisable if this information is taken on the day of collection. So this history helps us in understanding what to be expected. Now, one thing is that there was this in the same WHO manual, they have actually taken a sample and done the count every day for a span of a month. And, there's a lot of variation and fluctuation. So if it is 20 million one day, it could be 60 million the other day, and it comes down. So what it indicates is that if the patient is, say, unlucky, he may land up on a day where the count is 10 million, and we may label the patient as oligospermic, low sperm concentration. However, if that patient would have landed up, say, 2 days later when it was 80 million or 70 million, he would be normal. So therefore, I would strongly advise that whenever a sample is abnormal or the values don't meet the reference range, always repeat an analysis, especially if the patient doesn't come with a long history of analysis already done. Because in such cases, what we have, we'll be labeling the patient as with this specific abnormality. And with that condition, what will happen is that poor guy will always be considered to be in that bracket. So at least 2 analyses before you give a report, especially if it is in the early stages of diagnosis. In case of azoospermia, when there are no sperms in the ejaculate, one has to be very, very, very careful before reporting it. Because supposing the sperm concentration is extremely low, say 1 million per ml or even lesser than that, then what can happen is that when we do the analysis, and I'll just briefly talk about it, you may not notice that one single sperm. So if you do not notice it and you blindly look at 2 to 3 fields under the microscope and label it as azoospermia, and in case the wife gets pregnant, you've had it or the wife has had it. So be extremely careful while labeling azoospermia, because although the chances of that husband leading to a pregnancy is minimal, he can still lead to a pregnancy. And therefore, in cases of azoospermia, what we need to do is that if you don't see any sperm, completely centrifuge the entire sample, and after centrifugation, discard the supernatant, take the pellet and place it on a slide and see as many fields as possible, so that you ensure that there's not a single sperm before you label the patient as azoospermia. And that too, don't report after a single analysis, at least 2 to 3 analyses before you give a clear diagnosis of azoospermia. Mind you, these days, anybody working in the field of infertility, I always tell them you need to be extremely cautious of the reporting you give. Because even if you're doing an IVF, any patient that comes to you, you cannot guarantee 100% pregnancy. For 50% of the patients are going to be unsatisfied with the outcome, because the outcome for them would be a healthy baby. And when that doesn't happen, there's a lot of frustration, and something which has been erroneously done would become a big issue. So please be extremely careful while doing the analysis with the documentation, so that we don't end up in a mess later. Now, basic semen analysis, how do we go about it? We look at the viscosity of the sample, we look at the liquefaction time, which is around 20 minutes. You note the volume of the sample and pH. Actually speaking, in infertility, we don't get a lot of variation in pH, because pH alteration will occur if there is some inflammation of the accessory sex glands. And in such cases, they would have clinical symptoms, so they would be diagnosed much earlier. and they wouldn't be coming for infertility. So generally, we don't see drastic pH changes in infertile men unless they have a clinical condition which will be dealt with by the urologist. As far as microscopic analysis is concerned, we look at the concentration and count. Now, what is the difference? Concentration, when we talk of concentration, we're talking of the number of sperms per ml of sample. Now, and the count is the total number of sperms in the ejaculate. Now, when we are just doing a diagnosis, what is important is the count. For example, if the concentration is 30 million per ml and you have 2 ml of sample, it becomes 60 million, which is, the count of 60 million is fine. But if you are doing a processing of the sample, say for an IUI or an IVF, then we need to know the concentration because we use only 1 ml of the sample. So if the concentration is very low, but you have a greater volume, then you can use more of the sample to recover maximum sperms. Motility, basically, we do it quite subjectively. And in this case, we just see, how many sperms are, percentage of sperms which are rapid progressive, moving very fast or slow or immotile. So we generally count about 200 sperms and see how many of them were having rapid progressive motility. As far as motility is concerned, since it's very subjective, it is also subjective to error. And as we go ahead, I'll just tell you how to prevent that. And morphology, I will get into that. And viability. Viability is basically you're seeing the number of sperms that are dead as compared to the number that are alive. Now, one may ask that if you're doing a motility, why do we need to do a vitality staining or a viability staining? It can happen that the sperm is immotile but alive. And that is the reason when we see a lot of immotile sperms in a sample, we do the vitality staining. Now, how do we do the sperm concentration? Basically, we prefer in an infertility clinic, we prefer to use the Mackler chamber. The Mackler chamber, basically this was originally, the Mackler is the name of a company. It was made in Israel, but now we have local companies also providing it. Or you could use a simple Neubauer chamber or hemocytometer to count. Now, as far as the hemocytometer is concerned, we need to first dilute the sample using a fixative. Now, when it comes to dilution, so the dilution would be say 1:10, means you're taking say 0.1 ml of sample and then diluting it. A small marginal error in the taking the sample could lead to a magnified error. And mind you, we are assessing the fertility potential of the male on the basis of a semen analysis. And that too, we are taking a minuscule amount of sample, maybe 100 microliters, 50 microliters of the sample. And on that basis, we are assessing the fertility potential. So any error in the sample, representative sample that we're taking would be highly magnified. And therefore, we avoid using the Neubauer chamber because it requires dilution of the sample. Second thing, what happens is that in the Neubauer chamber, we need to count the concentration separately so that the number of sperms and the motility has to be done separately on an ordinary slide. So therefore, if we are having an infertility clinic, we prefer this Mackler chamber. And in this chamber, we have the grid, which on the Neubauer chamber is on the slide. It is on this circular cover slip. And the depth is put it in such a manner that we don't need to do any dilutions. We take about 5 microliters of sample. So the sample that is put in, when you put the cover slip, you see 10 squares. So basically you see 10 squares horizontally, 10 squares vertically. You are expected to count the number of sperms in 10 squares. So either 10 horizontal, 10 vertical, or if you wish, you can count horizontal and vertical and then divide by 2. So number of sperms in 10 squares, that's the concentration per ml. If the sperm count is very low, you can count all the 100 squares in the chamber and then divide it by 10. So that will be representative of the concentration per ml. So in this manner, we are able to easily determine the concentration of sperms in the sample. Motility is done pretty, as I said, you just look at the number of sperms moving ahead with good speed, and then you note down the rapid progressive, non-progressive, and immotile. This is vitality staining. The vitality staining is pretty simple. In the case of vitality staining, what happens is that if the sperm membrane is damaged, then the dye enters into the membrane and it gets stained. So all the sperms that are stained are the dead sperms, while the unstained ones are the live sperms because the membrane is intact, so the dye doesn't go in. So one can use dyes like eosin, negrosin, or trypan blue. Any dye can be used. Vitality staining need not be done in a routine condition, but yes, if you see a lot of immotile sperms, then we may want to see what is the reason for that. Now, morphology is basically, it's something which is very, very, very subjective, because after all, you're looking at the appearance of the sperm. The question, as you can see in the previous slide, these are stained. You have the head, the neck region, and the tail. And the last WHO manual made very strict criteria on the assessment of the sperm. So they have said that a child within 3 months of living with their partners, and in the first trimester, or not even the first trimester, first 2 months of pregnancy, they had undergone a semen analysis, and on that basis they have come up with these figures. However, interestingly, you will so the figure is 4% for sperm morphology. Now this becomes a little tricky when you are sitting in front of a patient, because if only 4 sperms out of 100 are normal, the patient is fertile. And if there's another patient who walks in who has 5%, 3% normal, you will call him abnormal. So it becomes very extremely tricky to how do you actually gauge. And secondly, you can imagine the amount of time that is taken. If you're going to measure 100 sperms, you're going to measure the length of the head, even if you do it computerized. If you're doing it on a microscope, you need a micrometer, and imagine measuring that. So easily it would take you about 25 to 30 minutes. And after that, the outcome that is doesn't really help you further in diagnosis or finding the course of treatment. Yes, maybe it will help on a research perspective, but from a clinical perspective, there is a limitation to this WHO. With all due credit to WHO, there is a concern, because when you make the criteria extremely strict, it becomes very difficult to decide on the course of treatment. Apart from that, now, if we look at the semen analysis, what does it tell us, the basic semen analysis? If it's normal, it tells us, yes, there are enough sperms in the ejaculate to reach the oocyte with a concentration of 15 million per ml. It tells us that, yes, they have good motility, so they'll reach the oocyte. But beyond that, it does not give us any information on the functionality of the sperms. Now, what do I mean by functionality of the sperms? First and foremost, the sperm need to, once they reach the cumulus, they reach the oocyte, they reach the cumulus cells, they need to traverse through the cumulus cells. And just a good motile sperm is not essentially going to be able to do it. So what the sperm needs is hyperactivated motility. And this is a very fast moving motility, zigzag kind, which helps the sperm go through the hyaluronic acid, the tightly bound cumulus cells, and reach the zona. Once it reaches the zona, the acrosome reaction takes place. And because of the acrosome reaction taking place, it is possible for the sperm DNA to enter into the oocyte. And now the problem that occurs is that, while as we know that the sperm has a very long journey from the testis to the epididymis, vas, through the female genital tract to the oocyte, the DNA is tightly packed and compacted, and the packaging of the DNA is done to keep it safe. Now, if something goes wrong during the packaging of the DNA, then the sperm DNA is fragmented. And depending on the level of fragmentation, it will influence the fertilization and subsequent embryonic development of the for post-fertilization. So therefore, now we have realized that even if the semen analysis is normal, there could be problems with DNA, and therefore we have the DNA fragmentation test, which basically looks at the amount of DNA that is intact and amount is fragmented. So what happens is that in this case, we prepare a smear of the sperms and you put it through SDS. So we get the spreading of the sperm DNA. And in case the DNA has been fragmented, so when you add SDS, there's no proper spreading of the sperms. So these are the sperms which have fragmented DNA. And these are the sperms, which this one where you see a good spread, that is an intact DNA sperm. So generally, if you find that more than 30% of the sample has fragmented DNA, then the prognosis in this case is poor. And generally, one of the major causes of DNA fragmentation is the oxidative stress. So if an individual is smoking, then there is oxidative stress, and these are the sperm individuals which have high DNA fragmentation. And in cases with sperms with high DNA fragmentation, whatever the modality of treatment, whether it's an IUI or an IVF or an ICSI, the prognosis is not so good. So therefore, it is advisable in cases where the individual is smoking or has unexplained infertility, where you have no proper reason for fertility, it could be high DNA fragmentation. And in this case, one would need to give antioxidants. Counter question could be that why don't we just give antioxidants everybody. So this ends on semen analysis, and if you have any questions, I can take them. So are there questions in the chat?
Yes, ma'am, I'll just tell you the questions.
Yeah, that will be better.
Yes, ma'am, the first question is, can a non-spermicidal condom be used for collection?
It may be, yes, if it's non-spermicidal, that is there, but sometimes the material with which it is made could be toxic to sperms. So as far as possible, we ask them to collect it in the semen collection. In rare cases where the individual is unable to give the sample, then maybe one can use that. But it is not preferable for sure.
Okay. Then what is the criteria for number of days of abstinence for sample collection?
See, when you're doing it for analysis, we try to keep it some standard because we said that there's so much of variation. So obviously, if you do it on, say, less than just 1 day of abstinence, the concentration may be low. If you take it 7 days, the concentration may be high, but the motility would be affected. Therefore, we try to keep it by the WHO between 2 to 5 days. However, that is for analysis. But if you're doing the collection for any procedure like an IUI or an IVF, I would recommend a shorter abstinence. That would give you a better quality of sperms, even if the concentration is not very high.
Okay, so between two analyses, how much gap do you require?
Okay, we should keep a gap of about a week when you are doing the preliminary analysis.
Okay, ma'am. Then is the sperm viability 58%?
The criteria for sperm viability reference range is 40%. So if you have more than 40% sperms which are viable, that's accepted.
Ma'am, then is potassium permanganate used for azoospermia?
For what? We don't use potassium permanganate for azoospermia.
Okay, then
yeah, because the only for azoospermia, the only thing we do is to confirm it, and for that we just do a centrifugation and then look at the pellet. That's all.
Okay, then can excessive masturbation cause oligospermia?
No, there's no such report at all.
Okay, then how does small oxidative stress help?
Well, fertilization, as you can see, is a slightly invasive process. So when the sperms bind to the zona, there is the exact mechanism is not known, but it is actually the acrosome reaction takes place, and then the entry of the sperm DNA takes in. So they have found that certain amounts. So in cases where their patients have been on a very high of doses of antioxidants, fertilization itself is compromised. Okay, so it does play a role there.
Okay, ma'am, and one last question. What is the minimum sperm count required for IVF?
See, IVF, we can, if you're doing a conventional IVF, where we just do the mixing of the eggs and sperms, we can manage with about even 10 million sperms per ml. And if you have, say, a good volume of the ejaculate, you have at least 20 million sperms, which would be good enough. Because for IVF, we use about 100,000 sperms per egg. So if you are, say, doing it for 6 to 8 eggs, you need about 100,000 to 600,000 to 700,000. So we may manage to get that. So that should be fine. However, if you are dealing with male infertility, so it's less than 15 million, and I would always advise that in addition to conventional IVF, one should do IVF and ICSI together. If we get embryos, then go with conventional IVF, go with those. If you don't, then you still have embryos from ICSI which can be used.
Okay, ma'am, I think the questions for this session are over. You can start the next one, ma'am.
Okay. So now we move to semen preparation. So basically, what is the objective? I mean, for actually, it's not just semen processing. I would say objective of entire ART is to mimic what is happening in vivo, in vitro. So here we are just trying to process the semen for it to mimic the role of the cervix. So what is the role of the cervix, and what we are trying to achieve in vitro is to first remove the seminal plasma, remove all the immotile sperms or the dead sperms. Along the sample also of sometimes contains macrophages, sometimes contains WBCs, sometimes contains immature germ cells. So the process that we used should also be able to block all these. And finally, you want a good yield of motile sperms, because whatever procedure do you, if you have a larger number of good quality motile sperms, the prognosis of the patient is better. And like I said, if we just take sperms, and in fact, very early in time, when Bob Edwards was attempting IVF, he managed to attain oocyte maturation, and then he took sperms from a fresh ejaculate, and he found that fertilization didn't take place. And then they realized that the sperms need to attain the capacity to fertilize the egg, which is what we term as capacitation. And during these things, things happen. One is the seminal plasma is totally removed, and obviously whatever procedure we do, we want to remove the seminal plasma, because if it enters the uterus, the woman is going to get cramps. Second thing is you're risking infection, because there's some in fact, in a study that I've done, we found 50% of the samples harbored bacteria, aerobic bacteria. So you're risking infection. Third thing is that the semen sample contains factors which prevent capacitation, which prevent the sperm from binding to the oocyte. So the seminal plasma has to be removed. So basically, the technique involves removal of the seminal plasma, and such that when that is removed, the sperm gains hyperactivated motility, which is different from the motility that we see in a good motile sperm, and then the capacity to bind to the zona. So this is the objective of semen processing. And if you look at it simply, what we try to do, so there are many methods. I mean, I think every few years we hear of a new method. So there is simple centrifugation, swim up, density gradient filtration, microfluidics, magnetic activated cell sorting, and more technique come up. If you look at it, principally what we need to do, seminal plasma and whatever else is in it. So the simplest way is what is done is the swim up technique, and you have heard about it. What was take ml sample, you do it in two separate tubes. So you have 1 ml, you prefer the round bottom tube so that there is increased surface area, and then you put it angularly for 45 minutes. And if the sample has been good, the motile sperm swim out top, you gently collect it, and you can use it for whatever technique or procedure you're using. Now there's another technique. Now in this case, what happens is our recovery is very poor. We hardly get about 10 to 15% of the sperms, because you have to be very careful not to go to the seminal plasma area. Ratio is lost, so you're going right at the top, and then you take the super top, if you are say doing and you need sperms, if you want an I give you a good number. On the other, this is the semen sample. This is the culture medium. You mix it thoroughly with a pipette. Make sure you don't make air bubbles. And after mixing it, you centrifuge it. The moment you centrifuge germ cells, whatever is there, you quickly discard the supernatant. And on that pellet, 1.5 ml of medium, mix it again. And after mixing it again, centrifuge it, discard the supernatant. So we left with this, and on that pellet, you gently overlay culture medium. Now, what will happen? You have to make sure that the pellet is not very tight, because if it is very tight, then the sperms will not be able to move out. So you just had a drop of medium, loosen the pellet, and gently add to the medium. Is no, but all you will get is motile sperms. In the case of centrifugation and then the advantage is that you'll recover more sperms because you have concentrated them into the pellet, and then when they swim up, you take them. The disadvantage is that centrifugation is known to generate reactive oxygen species. To add on, if the sample contains WBCs, then it will generate more ROS, which will damage the sperm membrane and be a hindrance to fertilization. So these are the two techniques. The other technique is the density gradient separation. The principle is simple. You use silica coated colloidal particles. So basically, we get ready-made kits. So basically, you are using a substance of altered density and you make a gradient. So you make an 80%, 45%, or 90, 45, and they most often we get them as kits. And the heavier one obviously goes down. A better way of separation would be that you first put the lighter one, and then with your pipette go underneath that and release the heavier one. So if you have a 80% and 40%, put the 40 first, then go underneath and release the 80. So 40 moves up. And then what you do is overlay it with the semen sample. So the volume of this is say 1.5, 1.5, 1 ml is the semen sample. Then you centrifuge it. The centrifugation speed in this case is much higher, because imagine in the previous case, it is just going down about 3 ml. Here it is quite a volume, and we use the conical tubes. Post centrifugation, the motile sperms will be present because the very density of the other cell types, immotile and motile sperms, the motile sperms will be there in the lowermost layer, and the best sperms pellet. Discard all the supernatant and take the pellet into a fresh tube, and we again add certain amount of culture medium, 1 to 1.5 ml, mix it thoroughly. The reason is that we don't want any of, and then the final pellet is again suspended in culture medium about 0.5 to 0.7 ml, and it is ready to use. So density gradient, we have found that in case there is any kind of contamination, including viral contamination or bacterial contamination, the final pellet that we get is free of microbial contaminants. So in that case, but we may sometimes get a mix. Sometimes people prefer to do only the swim up technique depending on what it is. So you don't want any extraneous agents to use for that. Now, what do you need? So if somebody wants to set up a simple IUI lab, and with the amount of infertility, and I think most obstetricians, gynecologists land up seeing infertile patients, and you want to set up a simple IUI facility, not IVF, you don't need much. What you need incubator, or you can even use, because the medium that we use does not require any CO2. So you just need even a heating block where the temperature is maintained at 37. A centrifuge if you're doing the swim up technique or the density gradient. A simple light microscope, because you definitely want to see that post-processing, what is the count and motility post-processing. A counting chamber, tubes, radius. And now what has happened in the last 2 years, we have a new device which is used for sperm separation, and I thought I should introduce it to you, is the microfluidic technique still remain either swim up, whether do post centrifugation or direct. and or microfluidic devices. So what happens in a microfluidic device is that these are the two devices. You have the outlet. You direct the semen sample to these droplets. This takes a very low amount. This takes a higher amount. This is just a different volume. And when you put the sample in through the inlet here, so it's not visible here, but there's a small inlet here, and this is covered with culture medium. Now what happens is that here you can see. So the sperms will go through the microfluidic device, and the microfluidic device basically call it like a maze, in nanometer size. So the sperms traverse through that, and the best sperms land up here, and like swimmer, they further move up into this big chamber from where they are collected. So basically what happens is that you have separation based on the movement of the sperms. Also, the sperms with the best or best sperms in terms of morphology as well as DNA integrity are found in the topmost layer and can be used for IVF or ICSI. Still data is coming in. Just to give you an idea, this is the inlet. How do you do it? It's extremely simple. Load the sample here and you put culture medium here, and then from this gently, and it's ready to use. So it is to incubate, of course, at 37 degrees, but you don't need any special CO2 incubator or anything. Second thing is that this does not require central. All this fear of ROS, oxidative stress is removed. And furthermore, what happens in this case is that we don't need to use any density gradient or any material. So that seems to be something which is very interesting, which has just come, I would say, about a year and a half. And what is very interesting to see here is that this is the amount of DNA fragmentation an unprocessed sample. And mind you that the semen sample contains glutathione, which is acting as an antioxidant, and therefore will be reducing the oxidative stress. But the moment you remove it from the seminal plasma, the sperms become very susceptible to oxidative stress. And this is what is happening in the case of density gradient separation. So you can see it is lower, but it is, if you look at it, and the amount of DNA fragmentation following microfluidics, it is much lower. So basically, we recover sperms which are having intact DNA, and naturally, the prognosis of doing any procedure with such sperms is going to be more useful. So this is about DNA fragmentation. Maybe I'll continue and finish off the IUI since it's basically a continuation before we take the questions. Now, after processing, so whether you are doing an IUI or an IVF or an ICSI, the method of semen processing remains the same. So there's no difference in the method which is used depending on the original concentration. You can make a choice. If it's an infected sample, go for density gradient. If you are having low sperms, if you're having a good volume, you could go for swim up, good concentration, or microfluidics. And as far as IUI is concerned, IUI actually came into the scene after IVF. So it is not, although in terms of chronology of treatment, it would be something you would do first. But when it comes to the development of the so-called IUI, and the success rates of IUI, even in the best cases, remains between 12 to 10 to 13%. So sometimes there's always an argument whether one should do an IUI. Well, it depends on the various factors. But if you're going to talk about a success of IUI, where it's obviously good in case of ovulation disorders, it's perfect for cases of cervical factors or a moderate male factor, then you are concentrating the sperms and putting them in. The results of IUI with unexplained infertility and severe male factor are quite poor. Tubal factor, obviously, it will not work. Also, it will depend on the timing of insemination. Now, another thing that has to be borne in mind is the timing of processing and the timing of insemination. Now, if we talk about the first thing is sample collection, it's strongly advised that as soon as the sample liquefies, about 20 minutes, we should process it. As I said, in the absence of seminal plasma, the sperms are exposed to oxidative stress. So secondly, if I had mentioned earlier that if the abstinence is lower, we are getting better sperms. So we don't want to keep the semen sample outside for too long. So once it is done, you and processing again, don't keep it out for too long. It should be inseminated. Now, what is the timing of insemination? There's always this discussion whether we should do a single insemination or double insemination. Well, the point is, let the sperms go in once the oocyte is there. So it is ideal if you could time the insemination 38 to 39 hours post HCG, because by that time the follicle in most cases would have ruptured and the sperms are there. For a long period of time, when we have so many sperms, we give more importance to the oocytes and the sperms, and you think that there would be sufficient. But imagine the situation that once the sperms have been processed, they attain that hyperactivity. And a lot of energy is being utilized by the sperms. So if you, by the time the sperms reaches, it requires a different sort of energy to traverse through the cumulus and the zona. And if you're going to leave the sperms outside for too long before insemination, we may not be giving it them at the optimal time. So 39 to 41 hours post HCG is found to be the optimal time to improve pregnancy rates, whatever it is, whatever best one can get. And of course, after processing, determine the post-wash motility and the count. And you can use the IUI catheter. It's not a big deal to do IUI. It's I think for any of you, it must be not really a difficult proposition. But if you are taking samples from outside, make sure that you're testing, at least checking it on your own before you proceed with it. So if you have any questions on this part also, I can take them.
Ma'am, they have questions on your earlier session.
Okay.
So the first question is, which is more better, swim-up or density gradient? And also, which is more commonly used in practice, irrespective of outcome?
Both are equally popular, I would say. If you have a low count, then you can't do a swim up. If you have a doubt of an infection, then you definitely have to go for a density gradient. Sometimes people see the cost factor often comes in practices here. So sometimes you don't want to do a density gradient for that reason. And supposing it's for ovulatory disorders, then one can directly go for swim up because there is no male factor involved at all. And you can directly go for swim up. Okay. So it is basically an individual choice. I would say in terms of popularity, because the recovery is higher with density gradient, it is generally preferred compared to swim up, but one can use both. And especially for IUI, I would say it's better one goes for density gradient because you have a higher recovery.
Ma'am, then the next question is the second time of mixing media similar to the first time, means quality wise? I think when you were talking about the overlay and everything, they just want to clarify.
Okay. See, basically, one thing when you use medium for processing, we have to make sure that the medium is sodium bicarbonate buffer, because you get different kinds of media and the buffering system is important. If it is sodium bicarbonated buffer, then you need a CO2 incubator. So what we use is the EPIS buffer. Now, when you are mixing it, in the first case, you have a sample and you're adding the medium and you actually mix it thoroughly. It takes a little while. Second time, what happens? The same medium that is used. Second time, what happens? It's a pellet. So you just add 1 ml of medium and you mix the pellets thoroughly. That's all. One thing you need to bear in mind that the medium has to be equilibrated, means that it has to be brought to 37 degrees, because we store the medium in the fridge and you can't directly add it because it will get a temperature shock. Although I didn't mention it, you need to make sure that it is equilibrated, brought to 37. So generally you incubate it for about 4 hours in the incubator. So it is warm enough to be used for whatever procedure you are using for.
Okay. And ma'am, is there any role of buffer media in IUI?
See, actually people did use simple culture medium like Earl's balanced salt solution, etc. Well, they could be used, but the problem is that, you know, the pH of the medium changes because if it is not HEPIS buffered, the HEPIS buffer helps to maintain the pH. Because see, by the time we process, it's about 30 to 45 minutes, irrespective of the technique you use. And in that case, if the pH has altered, then it is detrimental. So I wouldn't say using any simple buffer. You can use any simple culture medium that is available. Okay. Tissue culture medium.
Yeah. They're asking the full form of HEPIS media.
Hydroxypiperazine. If you want, I can message you. It is hydroxy. Let me check it out. The full form. Sorry.
Okay.
I'll do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay,
Tell me.
after semen collection, within
Yeah.
how much time should the IUI be done?
Okay, I get back to after semen collection. Yeah, you after collection, say proceeding, I would say not more than 2 to 3 hours, because say after collection, liquefaction, the processing, you are ready by about 1.5 hours. So don't keep it long, too long. I would say as soon as possible. So within 1.5 hours or so, post processing.
Okay, ma'am. Uh, yeah, I think, ma'am, we've answered most of the questions.
Yeah, hydroxyethyl piperethanosulfonic acid.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay, yeah.
So,
Okay, yeah.
okay, and okay, ma'am. So I think you have embryo grading remaining, but I think I had covered that for them. So if we could move on to the next one, probably the PGD or
Sure.
something.
Okay, cryo.
Yes, cryo and PGD. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So embryo grading you have covered, right?
Yes, ma'am.
You have done embryology, all this.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And the time lapse, you want something on that?
Time lapse also I've taken for them, ma'am.
Okay.
So if you could take,
Okay. So I'll move directly to cryo. And Istanbul consensus is something important because we used to have a lot of variation. So now we basically use the Istanbul consensus, which a group of embryologists have set that up.
you can take the Istanbul consensus, ma'am. I've not taken that for them.
Okay. So basically, you see, the problem was that when you're talking of morphology, it's subjective, and each one had our own criteria of calling this a good embryo or not so good embryo. So, there is finally like a consensus statement, which was this was done by the Alpha, which is a group of embryologists worldwide. And since it was done in Istanbul, so basically, you're looking at the timing of observation. You're not talking of time lapse, you're talking of conventional microscopy. So they have come up with that fertilization check should be 17 plus minus 1 hour. The check of syngamy is 23 hours and early cleavage 26 hours as far as ICSI is concerned, and 28 hours post IVF. And then day 2 embryo assessment 44 hours post insemination or post ICSI. Embryo assessment day 3 about 68, day 4 92, and 116 hours. Because the timing becomes important, because if I see something much later, then it's out of sync as far as this is concerned. And this is the grading. So, you call an embryo which is good as far as the cleavage state. So day 2, day 3 embryos, if you see less than 10% fragmentation, stage specific cell size, well, that's obvious, and no multinucleation. And about 10 to 25% fragmentation becomes fair, and severe fragmentation is more than 20%, would be a poor embryo, and more than 25%. Similarly, you have the grading for day 4. Most of the time, for all this while, we were primarily talking of day 2, day 3 transfer, or primarily day 3 versus day 5. But I think last 6 months to 1 year, people are now doing a day 4 transfer too. One of the possible reasons of day 4, it was difficult to really grade a day 4 embryo, with a compact morula, but now that criteria are being set in. So it is basically a good, if you see a total compaction, that's a good embryo. Which you see majority of the cells are compacted, then it's a fair embryo. And if you see individual cells, then it's not such a good embryo. As far as blastocysts are concerned, well, we are basically looking at the inner cell mass, the trophectoderm, and the stage of development, whether it's an early blastocyst or late blastocyst or hatching, and the level of expansion. And if you see an inner cell mass which is having a lot of cells, that's the good quality. Less cells is poorer quality. And as far as the trophectoderm is concerned, completely the trophectoderm, if there's a complete trophectoderm without gaps, uh, there is a school of thought, or a large number of people do believe that a trophectoderm is more important than the inner cell mass also. So if the trophectoderm is not complete and there are gaps in it, then the prognosis of these blastocysts is not so good in terms of possibly that, if it's not able to create a good placenta, what's the point of the inner cell mass? That's one of the things, but both are obviously equally important. So a good connected trophectoderm is a healthy one. And then, of course, she must have covered when you get poor embryos, it just could be a poor egg or a poor sperm. Culture media, if the pH temperature has been affected, it has it just blocks further development. And as we know that more than 50% of the embryos do not develop beyond day 3. And of course, contamination is a risk of the media. The disposables are sometimes toxic. The air is a major culprit which blocks embryo transfer. And of course, the environmental conditions. So that covers it. So we'll get to cryopreservation. Now, coming to cryopreservation, it's one of many things in IVF have been serendipity, right from ICSI, where somebody just by mistake Palermo injected the sperm. Even if it comes to cryopreservation, it was way back in time that the story goes that he was walking around in snow with a vial of sperms, and he dropped in snow and they were immotile. And then a little later, they regained motility, and that's when realized that, hey, we could use this for preservation. As far as the basic principle, and in fact, cryopreservation of semen has been done since 1950s. Pregnancies have been there, and it's not really considered a big deal. But as you go, you will realize that even today, we don't know which sample is going to recover well post cryopreservation as far as semen is concerned. However, since we have such a large number of sperms, we are not so very worried, because even if a few survive, we are fine. But when it comes to oocytes and embryos, naturally we are more concerned. So basic principle of cryopreservation is, one, you need to dehydrate the cell, basically remove all the water from the cells, and as we know that without water, all metabolic processes slow down. So to put it very simply, if you have a fruit and a dry fruit, the shelf life of a dry fruit is higher. So year 2, we dehydrate them. Another thing is, you store anything at lower temperatures, their shelf life increases. So same thing is done in cryopreservation. Dehydrate the cell, whether it's the sperm, the egg, the embryo, or a blastocyst, and then store them at low temperature. Now, how do you dehydrate the cell at so one aspect is that when you bring the temperature down, the cytoplasm starts becoming ice. So the water in the cell becomes ice and it crystallizes. So that's how the cell starts dehydrating and shrinking. Another is just by the osmotic difference. So the cell starts shrinking, and just because of the osmotic difference, and that also brings about dehydration of the cell. Now, the question is, what happens? In which cases does a cell, is there freezing, and in which cases it is osmotic? Now, problem is that whichever method you use, there is a damage to the cell. Now, in this case, when I say that ice is formed inside the cell, these ice crystals are not nice and smooth. They are sharp, and they damage the cellular organelles. And if they damage the nucleus, or they could damage the mitochondria, and the loss of cells because of crystallization, ice crystallization in cryopreservation is well known, and it creates a problem. On the other hand, when you give it an osmotic shock, that too creates problems. So basically, how does osmotic shock? I mean, ice crystal, you would have understood that they will totally damage the cellular organelles. But if you look at this particular visual, this is in a liquid medium, and then as there is intercellular ice forming here, the cells start shrinking. So if you're looking at a molecular level, these are the cells, and this is the place. Now, as the ice between the cells increases, you'll find that the cells get highly compressed. And this often leads to damage to the cell. And if you just keep this in mind, and when we compare this with the subsequent slide, when I show vitrification, you'll realize the change that occurs. So basically, when we are doing cryopreservation, we are trying to balance the act, the freezing by ice and the freezing by osmotic pressure, osmotic difference, so that there is minimal damage to the cell. Now, what happens when? Now, if the sample, whatever it is, whether it's a sperm sample or oocyte or embryo, if there is fast cooling that takes place, and when I say fast cooling, it's about 8 to 10 degrees per minute, there is more of intracellular ice formation. However, the cooling is slow. And when I say slow, it's like 0.3 degrees per minute. Then in these cases, there is more of extracellular ice formation. Now, this is, so basically, if you have a large cell, like say an oocyte, or even a cleavage stage embryo or blastocyst, if you do fast cooling, you'll have a lot of intracellular ice, and naturally these cells are going to be damaged because of the amount of ice that can be formed, because the oocyte is the largest cell. On the other hand, if you're doing it to a sperm which barely has any cytoplasm, a fast cooling does not damage the sperm. So generally we use fast cooling for the sperms. And if we don't use it anymore, slow cooling for the oocytes, for the embryos and blastocysts. We did attempt slow cooling for the oocytes, but honestly speaking, it never worked. So most of the time now it is given up. Now basically every cell type has its optimal temperature where it's a balance between intracellular and extracellular ice formation. And that would depend on the size of the cell, the shape of the cell, which would determine what is the optimal cooling rate for any cell type. So you have an optimal cooling rate, as you can see, for the mice embryos, it's less than 1 degree per minute. But if you look at sperms, this is the mice embryos, and if you look at the sperms, it's different. If you look at RBCs, we have nothing much to worry, so you can go at a very, very high cooling rate. So basically, the survival of the cell following cryopreservation will depend on the size, the amount of water content, the cryoprotectant, and I'll get to that toward the rate of cooling, the storage temperature. Basically, we store all cells at liquid nitrogen as far as the reproductive cells are concerned. So at minus 196, that is constant. And as important to the cooling rate is the rate of thawing or rate of warming. Because if that is not taken care of, we may have problems, because then as I call, cryopreservation is like putting the cell into hibernation. And when you get it back to the real world, we need to see that they are brought back without any shock. So the osmotic shocks that occur during cryo will also occur during warming, and we want to make sure that the cell is not damaged when we getting a temperature shock, say from minus 196, they come up to 37 degrees. So having said that, how do we prevent this damage? Basically, we want to get rid of the ice formation within the cell or outside the cell. So we reduce the damage that takes place. And that's where the use of cryoprotectants come in. So what these cryoprotectants do, they are all highly viscous substances. They basically replace the water in the cell as well as in the external environment. And therefore, what happens is that as the water levels come down, when you bring the temperature down, ice is not formed. And if ice is not formed, we don't have the problem with ice crystallization. So this is how cryoprotectants are used. Basically, we use two kinds. One, which can enter the cell, so we call them permeating, and those that cannot enter the cell. So the commonly used permeating cryoprotectants are dimethyl sulfoxide, DMSO, glycerol, and ethylene diol. Now, on the glycerol is primarily used, and non-permeating are primarily the sugars. So they are the large molecules which do not enter the cell, but they can remain in the cell, the suspension in which the cells are kept. Now, the problem is that if we have cryoprotectants, we can consider that, yes, we are safe now, because if the cryoprotectants are there and, we don't have to worry of all the potential damage. But the problem is that these cryoprotectants, especially the permeating ones, are toxic at high concentrations. So if we use this in full concentration, the cell will not die of ice crystallization, but they'll die because of the cryoprotectant. So we are in a catch-22 situation. We need to use the cryoprotectant at as low concentration as possible. So basically, sometimes we try to use two cryoprotectants, a combination of the permeating and non-permeating, so that we reduce the concentration of the permeating, so there's less cellular damage. So this is how the cryoprotectants are used. Now, I'll just tell you, so we have, as I said, the two different processes so far I've spoken about is fast cooling or fast cooling rate and the slow cooling rate. Now in slow cooling rate, what one does is, say you're doing your work at 24 degrees, you bring it down initially at the rate of 2 degrees per minute, and then you bring it down further at the rate of 0.3 degrees per minute. So you can imagine that to bring down the temperature by 1 degree, it takes you 3 minutes. So if you want to bring the temperature, say from 24 to minus 50, you can imagine the amount of time it takes. So it easily takes about 180 minutes or so. And we cannot manually decrease the temperature of 0.3 degrees per minute. So naturally, you need a computerized freezer, which brings about the temperature. Now, as the crucial point is when this crystallization takes place. So this is an old method. We don't use it in embryology at all. I think 99% of the embryologists do not prefer this anymore. When the temperature comes to 5 degrees, to prevent the crystal formation, we would take any metal spatula or a forceps, dip it in liquid nitrogen, which is minus 196, and touch it very close to the area where the embryos are loaded onto a straw. Now, just to give you a brief idea how we do it, you have the embryos, whichever, whether it's an embryo or a blastocyst, we would load them in those days. In those days, I would say we never managed to make blastocysts. We only had embryos. Load them into a straw, and this straw, very close to the area of the embryos, you would touch it with the spatula, not on the embryo, so that there's an immediate drop in temperature without ice formation. And then slowly the temperature is brought down to about minus 50. After that, we dump it in liquid nitrogen. So this was the slow freezing protocol used for oocytes and embryos, and it could even be used for sperms. Now you can imagine that because the oocyte size is so much, there was so much damage, and therefore oocyte freezing didn't come into the picture till about 2007, 2008, because it was not possible to get 100% recovery of the oocyte. There would be damage. As far as embryos were concerned, even if we had a 6 to 8 cell embryo, even if some of the blastomeres did get damaged, we were still safe, because the embryo being a totipotent cell, the rest of the blastomeres would help, and we could manage to make, the embryo could lead to implantation. Now, as far as semen freezing is concerned, we use the fast cooling method. It's extremely simple. Basically, you need the cryoprotectant and you need the sample, and both need to be having equal volume. So what you do is, you have the sample. Supposing the sample is 2 ml, you need 2 ml of cryoprotectant, and drop by drop, you add the cryoprotectant and mix it. Now imagine both are highly viscous. So you mix it thoroughly, and then you can put it into vials. So any cryo vial, or you can load it onto a straw, keep it in liquid nitrogen vapor for about 10 minutes, and then dip it in liquid nitrogen. Or we can gradually bring the temperature down. So you put it in the refrigerator, freezer, liquid nitrogen vapor, and direct into liquid nitrogen. So it is quite a simple technique. Now, what can we freeze? We can freeze the raw semen sample, or you could process the sample and then cryopreserve that. As of now, both have their advantages and disadvantages, and one cannot really say that this is the way to go about it. Now, the next method of cryopreservation is vitrification, and this is the most popular method for embryo cryopreservation today. And it's also possibly, I would say, the only method available for cryopreservation of oocytes. Vitrification by definition means preservation at low temperatures, extremely low temperatures, without freezing. However, colloquially, so technically, if you say I'm freezing by vitrification, it is incorrect, because if it's freezing, there's no vitrification. However, colloquially, to explain to the patients, people do say that we are freezing by vitrification, but do remember that technically it is incorrect. So what happens in vitrification is that you have the tissue which is suspended. Its temperature is brought down very quickly, so it bypasses the solid phase of ice and directly goes to the glass-like state. So the culture medium containing the sample, the temperature is brought down so quickly that it directly gets into this transparent glass-like state. Now, this is, if you see any book on vitrification, you're bound to see this image. So here you have buffer, and as the temperature comes down, you see the ice formation indicated by this white thing. However, when you add high concentrations of cryoprotectants, you have ethylene glycol, DMSO, and sucrose, and you bring the temperature down, it doesn't form any ice, and you can see it's transparent. So when there is no ice formed, you are not worried about any problem with ice intracellular or extracellular. Now, how do you attain vitrification? You need very high concentrations of cryoprotectants, and you need very high cooling rates. So that is about vitrification. So what happens in vitrification is that you can see, if you remember the earlier image, where moment you add the solution with the cryoprotectant, there is no change in the location of the molecules. And because there is no change in the location of the molecules, you will find that there is no damage to these cells. So the molecules remain as they are as you bring the temperature down, and that is safe for them. So vitrification depends upon cooling rate, viscosity, and volume. cooling rate is very high, viscosity is also very high, and volume is low. And when I say volume, you're handling less than 1 microliter of sample, and cooling rates are like thousands, 20 to 30,000. It's much, much faster than semen. So how do you cool? We have devices. So this is various devices. So you take that and just put the egg or this embryo onto that device and immediately put it into liquid nitrogen. So basically what you do is you take the sample, put it in what is called as an equilibration medium, and in that equilibration medium, the water in the cell is replaced by the cryoprotectant, which is in much higher concentrations than what has been used earlier. And this is then transferred to the vitrification medium. It's a little tricky because the cryoprotectant makes the embryo float, and within 1 minute you're supposed to load it physically under the microscope on this device, like which is called a Vitrifit, or you have many in the market, and immediately directly put it in liquid nitrogen, and from liquid nitrogen it goes into the liquid nitrogen can. So you have to be careful that even for a moment, even for a fraction of the second, it should not come out of liquid nitrogen, otherwise vitrification will not occur. So you can see that is open vitrification, where directly the embryo comes in contact with liquid nitrogen. Sometimes if the sample is infected with HIV or hepatitis B, there is concern that we should not directly put in liquid nitrogen and the risk of transmitting. We use something like a device like this. But in India, open is popular. Closed vitrification is not used unless it's an infected sample. So this is, as I said, you put it in equilibration medium, the cell shrinks, and then as the cryoprotectant goes in, it expands, and then you put it on your device, or what we call a carrier, and transfer it. Then when you warm it, it goes through a series of dilutions. The purpose being you want to remove, as I said, the cryoprotectant is toxic. So you have to make sure that you totally wash off the cryoprotectant. So it goes through a lot of dilution and washing before the embryo goes back to the similar medium in which it was taken. And then you incubate it for at least 2 to 3 hours before the embryos are transferred. Some people may even want to keep it overnight, so you're sure the embryo is growing further, then the prognosis is extremely good. But accordingly, you decide and you do the transfer. So if you want to put it graphically, slow cooling is gradual. If you fall, you have some scope of getting up. Vitrification is where you are directly dropping within a second from room temperature of 24 degrees, temperature comes down to minus 196. So either it happens or it doesn't happen. If it happens, the prognosis is definitely better, and that is why you will see that outcome with vitrification is found to be much better, and it's also now being used for oocytes. It's highly skill dependent because you're working with very low volumes and you have to work very, very quickly. What do you cryopreserve? You can cryopreserve semen, sperms, oocytes, zygotes, embryos, blastocysts, everything can be cryopreserved. When do you do semen? For individuals undergoing chemotherapy, easier said than done, because very often, in the current scenario, we don't have, lot of, there's so much of rush at the cancer hospitals that it may not be possible sometimes to actually provide the counseling required to the patients. For donors, it is mandatory. We need to preserve the samples, quarantine for 3 months before they can be released. When patients are not available for treatment, the husband is not available working in services. And in ART, we always cryopreserve and keep one sample so that on the day of procedure, if the husband or the partner is not able to give a sample, we have something cryopreserved, and that also gives them relief. Oocytes, of course, cancer therapy and delayed pregnancy for whatever reasons. And sometimes people not intending to do oocyte cryopreservation have landed doing it because they didn't have a sperm sample. Zygote transfer cryopreservation is not really done at all because you have so many zygotes, and why do you want to cryopreserve them? It was primarily being done in Germany and Italy because legally they were not allowed to do it. Embryos, of course, we have more embryos and you're not going to transfer more than 2, max 3, you will need to cryopreserve. So having done the cryopreservation by whichever way, by vitrification, if it's embryos or sperms, can be by cryopreservation. You are storing them in cryo cans, but one has to be very, very careful on the documentation, because as I said, vitrification, you cannot even remove the sample for a fraction of a second. So the labeling on the device is fine, but how will you search for it? So imagine if you land up in such a situation, you should know where the sample is located. You cannot remove it out, look at the name, oh, not right, put it back. So you have to be very sure in which cryo can it is, which canister it is, which goblet it is. So your documentation has to be extremely good, because most of the time the patients are not going to come back. Sometimes you may have patients that become pregnant and come back after 2 to 3 years. You need to know where they have kept, and these cans need to be topped with liquid nitrogen regularly, because if the can dries up, we have lost the embryos or whatever is stored in that oocytes in there. So any questions here?
Ma'am, they had two questions I missed in the last this thing. Role of pentoxyphylline in sperm motility.
Okay. Now, pentoxyphylline is primarily used when you use testicular sperms, because you see testicular sperms are immotile, and therefore we are not sure the sperm we are picking up for ICSI, whether it's motile. So you actually, more than pentoxyphylline now, theophylline is being used. So, moment you put it in that, there is a hyperactivated motility which helps you identify the sperm. Pentoxyphylline also increases if you are adding it in vitro, motility of the sperm. But the effect lasts for a very short time. In 20 minutes, it comes down.
Okay. And ma'am, how do you increase the sperm motility in vitro and in vivo?
One of the ways, because when we talk of motility, we are talking of percentages. So one of the ways of doing it is when we are trying to, that's where I said shorten the abstinence, we find sperms with better motility. Sometimes, one of the reasons for poor motility would be the stress oxidative. So that's the antioxidants in low concentrations playing a role. In vitro, we can't really do much except select the motile sperms. Pentoxyphylline and theophylline all are transitory. So we can't really improve motility in that sense. But yes, you're getting a concentration of motile sperms.
Okay. And ma'am, in vitrification, what should be the rate reversion of temperature?
It's immediate. So when we start warming it, so moment we directly get the device, the vitrifit or whatever device we are using it, immediately we keep the dilution medium ready. And moment we get it from the liquid nitrogen, we put it in the dilution medium so the embryos float out. And then we have a protocol which is varying with the company's kits you are using. So it's about 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes, or some are 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute. So depending on that, you have to shift it. It's also very important to follow the protocol given by the thing, because it's standardized depending on the cryoprotectants concentration of cryoprotectants used. Because unfortunately, as there are kits available, they tell us what the component is, but they don't tell us the concentration. And because of that, we really do not know, as far as right from culture medium to any medium, of what the actual concentration of the components is. So that is the reason you have to follow the protocol. So basically, it would vary from anywhere between 10 to 12 minutes or to the max. And for cryopreservation, it's about 5 to 7 minutes. But although I say 7 minutes, you can only load 2 to 3 embryos on a device. So if you have 10 embryos, you'll have to repeat the procedure 3 to 4 times. So that's how it takes longer than, say, slow freezing.
Okay. And ma'am, how much time can we store sperms and ova in cryopreservation?
Technically, it can be for any amount of time. If I recollect right, they had a semen sample which was stored for 15 to 17 years. So it doesn't matter as long as you're topping your liquid nitrogen can and you have sufficient liquid nitrogen. But however, you can imagine the number of samples one would keep collecting, and practically it becomes impossible. So the couple signs a contract of how long they want it, and then they are sent reminders, and then not more than 5 years. Of course, if the couple wants it stored longer, and they can extend their contract. Otherwise, we don't want to keep it, because you can imagine the flight would be how many cryo cans and stuff can you maintain. So that's the reason it's there. So they basically sign a contract and they keep renewing. There is a difficulty because sometimes you'll find that, the patients are not available. So then we do have difficulties sometimes, because they are untraceable. And what do you do with these embryos? So we sometimes try to take all that in during the consent, but these are practicals, and even if they have said so, it's not really very easy to discard embryos. But technically, time is not the limit.
Okay, ma'am, I think you can take the next lecture.
Okay.
Sir will be taking his lecture tomorrow, so you can continue, ma'am.
Okay, sure. So now we are going to be talking of pre-implantation genetic testing. So let me just get the terminology right. Earlier, we used to call it PGD and PGS. So basically, what we are trying to do is determine so PGD was genetic diagnosis when you knew there is a history of any kind of genetic abnormality in the family. So you're looking at a specific gene, or you're looking at a specific area of the gene. So that was pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And PGS was genetic screening, which was primarily aneuploidy screening. So presuming that many of the embryos that we had were aneuploid, and because they were aneuploid, they failed to implant. So that is the reason one would do a screening and select embryos which were not aneuploid and transfer them. However, last year the terminology has been changed and we call it specifically PGTA. So pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy. PGTM, so you're looking at single gene or monogenic disorders. So then you specifically look only at that gene which is desired, or pre-implantation genetic testing for structural rearrangements. So having said that, the focus primarily here is going to be on PGTA, because that is directly concerned with improving the success rate of ART. So when should we be doing a PGTA? Well, one would not want to do it on all the embryos, and you will realize why I'm saying that. Because the procedure is quite invasive. So I will talk about that a little later. So when you have more embryos, now supposing if there is a woman who we have only 2 embryos, then or 3, I would rather transfer them. And even if it's aneuploid, well, it will not implant, or if it implants, it'll be an early pregnancy loss. But if I'm going to have 15 embryos, then well, one option would be that I keep transferring through 5 warm embryo transfers, subsequent transfers. But supposing the best embryo comes in the 5th cycle, the patient may lose their patience to wait till then. So generally, you would want to do it when there are many embryos available for transfer. You would do it in oocytes from older women and severe male factor patients, and primarily recurrent implantation failure. So, if you look at the data around the world, PGTA is quite popular in US compared to, say, in the other countries. Now, they did a survey of about 150 clinics and found that majority of the cases where they did PGTA were in cases of advanced maternal age, recurrent implantation failure, and unexplained pregnancy loss. 25% actually did it for sex determination, and obviously, if it's being done here, they'll be behind bars. So how do we do it? These are done in either embryos on day 3, or they are done at the blastocyst level. So in day 3, we actually use spatial medium and gradually make a laser shot on the zona. And after a laser shot on the zona, you gradually aspirate one of the blastomeres and get a single blastomere, and then this is sent for analysis. So this is what we would do in cases of cleavage stage embryos. However, as you can see, we cannot remove more blastomeres. You can only remove 1 blastomeres, at the most 2. So, this is not popular anymore, because sometimes what may happen is that the embryo could be mosaic, and it becomes very difficult to come to conclusions from 2 blastomers. So trophectoderm biopsy is now the method of choice. So you take about 6 to 7 cells from the trophectoderm. Of course, you need to be careful that you're taking it from the area which is far away from the inner cell mass, and then they are subjected to analysis. So if you are doing earlier one did fish is now no longer done, because obviously you can only look for 5 to 7 of the chromosomes. So generally, if we are looking of sex-linked disorders, you would look at the sex chromosomes, or you would be looking primarily, if you're looking for Downs, then chromosome 21. And then the recent one that is most popular amongst the, these keeps changing with time. So even today, one cannot be extremely sure of which of these techniques is the best for genetic analysis. What is used now is the next generation sequencing. So in this case, what happens is that you have their DNA, which is fragmented, and each region of the GNO is sequenced multiple times. So what happens is it's broken up into sequences, and then multiple regions are sequenced. So supposing there is an aneuploidy, then when you look at the signal, so for example here, if there is a signal which is higher, then you know that there is an aneuploidy with an extra set of chromosome, or here where there is a single set of chromosome. So this is how the next generation sequencing works. So you are basically doing a sequence of the whole chromosome, whole genome. Now, what could be the potential outcomes of pre-implantation? You may get that all the cells are normal. So when you see something like this, you have taken it, everything is fine, it's perfect. Supposing it's a full aneuploid blastocyst, then whatever testing you do, you will get abnormality and you will discard that embryo, or you decide that you're not going to be transferring it. But there would be mosaicism, and a situation may arrive that you may land up with a few of the abnormal cells. Now, if by chance you take all these cells, then you would say that the embryo is aneuploid. But if you land up taking this, then it could be that the embryo is normal. So there is a little risk involved in this, and there will be an error also. So this becomes a little tricky when you have mosaic embryos. So because the chances of what we are taking, and also there's another theory that has come up, that is the trophectoderm a right representative? Because if the trophectoderm is mosaic, it doesn't matter as long as the inner cell mass is normal. But what could be a situation is that maybe the embryo throws off the abnormal ones to the trophectoderm, but the inner cell mass is normal. And by just a trophectoderm biopsy, are we throwing away the good embryos, especially when it comes to mosaic embryos? Now, what do we do? So if you have a healthy embryo, fine, we transfer it, and obviously the pregnancy rates are better, prognosis is good. But what do we do with aneuploid embryos? Discard them. But what if you don't have any more embryos? If you don't have any normal embryos, what do you do? So there have been cases where people have transferred the abnormal embryos, aneuploid embryos, and 49% resulted in pregnancies or live births, and 9% had miscarriages. So, and it is also not to the outcome, one doesn't know whether it is associated with the percentage of aneuploidy, but they do find that single mosaic aneuploidy actually gives a better outcome. If there is aneuploidy with extra chromosomes, then the prognosis is not good. So, well, if you have a choice, one should not be transferring aneuploid embryos. But if you don't have anything, we are still transferring aneuploid embryos. Now, when it comes to mosaic, there is also this constant discussion whether the embryo is capable of self-correction. So what can happen is that there is a mosaic embryo, there are a couple of cells, what we have detected are abnormal, but could it be that there is an overgrowth of the normal cells and this mosaic embryo actually becomes normal in the future? And there's also a theory going around that maybe what we see abnormal in the trophectoderm is actually the displacement of these from the inner cell mass during the formation of the blastocyst to the trophectoderm. Well, what could be the outcome of mosaic embryos if they are transferred? Well, there could be implantation failure and pregnancy loss, which in a way is acceptable. But if a mosaic embryo leads to an abnormality and the pregnancy continues, then of course it's something which is going to be of great concern. So there are guidelines set for the transfer of mosaic embryos, and the guidelines are that the risk of an abnormality is nearly 15%, especially in the case of trisomy 16, 18, 21, 45X, 47XXY, and 47XXS. The risk is, what would you say, intermediate in case of trisomy 15 and 20. And in case of trisomy 30, the risk is very low. And there is literally no risk in case of trisomies 1 to 12, 15, 17, 19, 22. So as you can see, this is from data what has been obtained. And generally, if you have monosomy, then these embryos generally don't survive. So if one has to make a choice of transferring aneuploid embryos or mosaic embryos, one has to take into consideration the level of mosaicism. So the question is, PGT with fish way back in the 19 was reported. But even today, it's not that we can be 100% sure and say, like, say, vitrification is here to stay, ICSI is here to stay. We still don't know whether PGTA is meant for everybody. I mean, it is a very powerful tool, but whether every individual, every embryo should go through PGT, because first is you are using laser shots to create a hole in the zona that is invasive, then you're aspirating the blastomeres, you're removing some cells from the trophectoderm. So these are the questions that come in, and by that, and then you're cryopreserving the embryos. So these are the questions that come up with it, whether it's going to affect a subsequent outcome. And then again, if we talk about certain levels of low risk, and if aneuploid embryos have also led to normal pregnancies, and the concern remains that should we be doing it in all cases? So as per the guidelines, I would say that as of now, we would say that yes, we definitely, it has a big role in recurrent implantation failure, pregnancy loss cases, and maybe in older women. Now the fact is that being invasive, we have always been looking whether we have techniques by which we can select embryos from morphology. And it's an interesting study where they actually randomized women to PGTA versus morphology. And both are totally different techniques. And actually they found that there was no difference in ongoing pregnancy rates, whether you had selected embryos based on a PGTA or morphology. However, let's remember that when it reaches the blastocyst age, in any case, the prognosis is better. So routine use of PGTA, I would say one should not go for a routine use of PGT because yes, you would have less failures per transfer. But then if you look at it, if you look at its per ovum pickup, it is not going to change. So if you had 5 embryos of which 3 were normal, maybe you will transfer them during the next transfer, but then the time to pregnancy would increases. Cumulative pregnancy rate is not difference, and there's no difference in live birth rate as if you're scoring the blastocyst well. Also, the cost becomes a major factor, and the Americans have actually calculated what is the cost, because if you are doing the PGTA for say 6, if there are 2 to 3 embryos, like I said, there's no need to do anything. But if you're having more embryos, say 6, 8, 10, then you want to assess each embryo. So the cost becomes very, very high. It's nearly $15,000 US. It's said to get a 50% likelihood of a euploid embryo. And as the woman gets older, where there are more abnormal embryos, the cost becomes still higher. So it becomes, if you're looking at 20,000 rupees per embryo, and if you have 5 to 6 embryos, the cost goes to nearly ₹1 lakh plus the cost of IVF. So it becomes a factor which is limiting its use. And also the other aspects that I said is the invasiveness, and also the availability of skilled embryologists who can do the biopsy. So having said that, yes, there is trauma. About 30% of embryos do get damaged because of the biopsy. Also, there is a concern that you're removing a few cells. Will it affect? Practically, it may not really affect, because the 6 to 7 cells from a trophectoderm may not really affect future development. And thousands of babies have been born following PGT. However, some animal studies have indicated fetal neural tube or adrenal development anomalies in animals born from biopsied embryos. So it's still, I would say, a technique which is still being investigated and not for routine clinical use. And even the ASRM says that the value of PGTA for aneuploidy as a screening test for IVF is yet to be determined. And therefore, it is a good tool in certain situations. So yes, as of now, PGTA application. So we have 3 major societies in India dealing with IVF. One is the Indian Society of Assisted Reproduction, Indian Fertility Society, and the Academy of Clinical Embryologists. And in a consensus that was drawn by all the 3 societies together, cumulatively, and we've come to the consensus that PGTA as of now should, till we have more data or evidence, should be used for recurrent implantation failure, RPL, and in all these cases counseling is a must, because even today we find that there may be certain you have discarded the embryos and patient takes time. Like I remember a couple who had just 3 embryos which were discarded because by PGS they were found to be aneuploid, and subsequently the lady were destroyed and the lady conceived normally with a healthy pregnancy. So this is about PGTA. If you have any questions for this also, you're welcome.
Ma'am, they want you to repeat the NGS.
Okay.
NGS slide.
Okay, so this is next generation sequencing. So what happens is that each region of the genome is sequenced multiple times. So otherwise you are not going to see it. So you will have multiple short sequences, correct? And then these are magnified and then amplified rather, and then they are compared to a standard known human genome. So if this and this match, you will see a line like this. But if supposing there was triploid, then you will see the mark will not be alike with the compared to the human the standard known sequences. It will be higher, whilst when it is less, you will see it lower. So this is the tool that is being used. It's all done totally automated, and you have special geneticists who are skilled geneticists working on this. So this is currently the thing. But again, if you are testing, this would there's no chance of error here as far as NGS is concerned. So as of now, it seems that this would be giving, but again, you'll be looking at each chromosome by creating all these fragments and then putting it through the NGS.
Ma'am, then they're asking, when you do the blastomia biopsy, will they have any effect in terms of increased chances of anomalies due to cell membrane disruption?
See, actually, when you're doing a biopsy, you give a laser shot. And that is a concern. Like I said somewhere, that there is a fear that we are doing it's invasive. One is we could damage, because you have to be extremely careful to stay away. Now, at least when you're doing an embryo biopsy, you can be between the blastomeres and give your laser. But as far as trophectoderm is concerned, you are going to be, and the heat generated by the laser. But so far, we haven't come up with any concrete data, but that does remain a risk of possible damage. But supposing there is a damage, then the embryo wouldn't survive. So it will not lead to problems later on. Then the blastocyst won't survive.
Okay. And do you inform the patient and relatives that a mosaic embryo is being transferred?
They have to be informed. That's why counseling is a must. Counseling is absolutely a must, because the couple needs to know exactly what is being done. And I would say in ART, all the decisions should be taken in consultation with the couple. So one should not take any decision for any of the techniques on their own. You may give your viewpoints, you may give your suggestions, but it's a couple who has to decide.
That's it. I think we've answered all the questions, ma'am.
Okay.
So thank you so much for your valuable time, ma'am. I think the lectures were brilliant, crisp, and up to the point.
So I hope it helps you all. And if you have any queries, you can always, I've left my email there. You can send me. I'll be happy to answer them.
Sure, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye. Good night.
Good night.
So are you guys also working in the hospital as of now?
Yes, ma'am. We're all working.
So you're not tired by the end of the day to have a lectures for 2 hours at so late
They're
at
all
night?
until late night. So then, and they're requesting.
Okay, sure.
Yes.
In case you need anything, please feel free to ask. Okay?
Sure, ma'am.
Okay. Bye-bye. Good night. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
I don't energize, Bobby.